This is the opiate of the people, quotation goes on. And it goes on even more beautifully to say that... no, it's not from me. It's not from me. It goes on to say that criticism of religion has plucked the flowers from the chain, not so that men and women may wear the chain without consolation, but so that they may break the chain and cull the living flower. It's from Karl Marx. It's the opening of his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. It's the most misrepresented quotation probably of the 19th century. It's the one where he doesn't say religion is the opium of the people.
Welcome, I'm Ben Boyce. This is the Dr. Junkie Show, and that was the late great Chris Hitchens reading Karl Marx's infamous quote about religion being the opium of the masses, the topic of today's episode. As housekeeping, I plan to do an upcoming episode on the reasons I don't do commercials on this podcast, and I want to talk a little bit about the direction this podcast is taking and where I see this project going, since it's obviously changing. And in preparation for that, I invite comments and suggestions from the audience. But for today, I want to start by asking you all to think of a time when you changed your mind about something big, something ideological or religious. Maybe you used to be anti-abortion and now you're pro-choice, or maybe you grew up believing in Santa Claus and now you think he's made up. Pick something that's personal to you. Now try to spot the process by which that change took place. How did you change your mind? Did you just wake up one day and say, enough with this Jesus stuff, forget this Santa nonsense, I think I'm going to just stop believing in these guys for a few years and see how that works for me? Did that happen? Or was the process a bit more complicated than that? Of course, it was way more complicated than that. I mean, if we all just randomly changed our positions on important issues, no one would know who you are or what you stand for because it could all change tomorrow. So no, we don't just randomly change our minds about important issues, but we do change our minds a lot. And as Friedrich Hegel, the first of many Friedrichs I'll talk about today, he's famous for describing the process by which that change happens. He calls it dialectics, and as soon as I start describing it, you'll probably realize it's much older than just him. Socrates was actually a practiced dialectician, if there is such a thing, 2,000 years before Hegel. And if you know what Socrates did with his days, you can get a pretty basic idea of what Hegel's dialectic is all about. Socrates would get up in the morning and wolf down a bowl of Fruity Pebbles. Okay, they didn't have Fruity Pebbles, but he'd eat something, and then he'd head off to the center of whatever city he was in that day to talk to people about stuff. And the way he talked to people generally pissed them off. It's why he was eventually sentenced to death. He would start by getting them to confirm a taken-for-granted norm. He might say, "You think we shouldn't kill people, right?" But when the person said, "Yeah, of course I believe that. Why shouldn't I?" Socrates would flip the script by presenting a counterexample. He might say, "Well, because sometimes someone is trying to kill you, and if you don't kill them, aren't you volunteering to die?" "Ah," the person would say, "Ha ha, good one, Socrates, you got me. Let me update my thesis from, you shouldn't kill people, to the more specific claim, you shouldn't kill people unless your life is being threatened. You clever rascal, Socrates." But Socrates wouldn't stop there. He'd challenge the new thesis all snarky-like, and he'd piss off the stranger he was talking to even more. He might say something like, "Okay, but what if the person trying to kill you can be stopped with less than lethal force? What if you have a stun gun in one hand and a shotgun in the other? Shouldn't you feel obligated to use the lesser of the two if they'll both work?" And this would go on, each step pissing the person off a little bit more. That was Socrates. That's Hegel's dialectics in a nutshell. Hegel said that everything is in a process called dialectical change. And he literally meant everything, from biological life, to religious ideology, to cultural norms, to legal standards of acceptability and morality. And even though it's usually much more complicated than it needs to be in classrooms where Hegel's taught, he was really just saying what Socrates had demonstrated, that the process through which these things change is one of negotiation, whereby an old norm is challenged in some way, and the resulting problem requires some sort of adjustment to the original construction that we once took for granted. Then a new norm emerges, and then that norm itself will also be challenged and refined down the road. It never ends. Nothing, said Hegel, is outside of this dialectic. Nothing, said Hegel, remains the same throughout history. It's all trapped in this framework of how things work. And he advanced this thinking all the way to notions of right and wrong, noting that places throughout history where things that we see as awful were acceptable, and where things we see as acceptable today were considered awful. He concludes that there is no such thing as right and wrong. There's just mental models of what is allowable and what is not. And those models are propped up, or at times reshaped, by the Socratic method. State a thesis that's taken for granted, challenge it with an antithesis, a statement that disproves or sort of breaks the original thesis, and then try to reconcile the challenge with the original statement by updating it to get rid of the exposed incorrect aspect of it while preserving whatever was of value to begin with. I mean, pointing out that you shouldn't kill someone if you can prevent them from harming you isn't the same thing as throwing out that original statement that you shouldn't kill somebody. You're just updating it to be more specific, more exactly aligned with our current cultural understanding of what is right and what is wrong, what is acceptable and what is unacceptable, what's possible and what's impossible. That's all Hegel's dialectics is. Now let's get to the point of this episode. In Marx's book, A Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of the Right, he drops this infamous quote. He says, "Religious suffering is, at one and the same time, the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people." That statement has long been taken by many to mean that Marx was super anti-religious, that was his whole goal in life was to destroy Christianity. But he also said this in the same book. Religion is the general theory of this world, its encyclopedic compendium, its logic in popular form, its spiritual point d'or, its enthusiasm, its moral sanction, its solemn complement, and its universal basis of consolation and justification. Religion is the fantastic realization of the human essence, since the human essence has not acquired any true reality. The struggle against religion is, therefore, indirectly the struggle against that world whose spiritual aroma is religion. So clearly his point is a bit more nuanced than a simple disavowal of all religions. And that's what today's episode is about, the opium of the masses. So let's dive in. Karl Marx was a philosopher and economic theorist whose book, The Communist Manifesto, is often attacked for all sorts of things that, as far as I can tell, it doesn't endorse. In fact, I don't really read the Communist Manifesto as an endorsement of anything, so much as a prediction of what's to come, a prophecy of what will happen if something doesn't change. Marx was looking back through history and recognizing that every time groups of people reached a certain point where the haves and the have-nots were at tension at a level where it was unavoidable for something to break out, for something to explode, that's exactly what happened. That those that were under oppression, whether they were enslaved people or people who were just feeling the economic burden of the ruling and rich class, whatever the specifics in different historical eras, the oppressed group eventually has had enough and they rise up and rebel and there's something like a revolution. And then the system sort of reshapes itself and the whole process starts over again. And I've talked about this a lot on the show. The built-in downsides of capitalism, they aren't hard to spot. That hatred and boredom many of us have at jobs that we work, which leads to depression and anxiety and a general loss of contentment. All things that can obviously cause us to turn to alternative sources of pleasure and fulfillment, like drugs. Capitalism also alienates, it separates consumers from the products we consume and factory workers from the products they assemble. We talked about this last episode with the common example of the meat section in your supermarket. How many of us would buy a pound of ground beef if we had to drive over to John the farmer's house, walk through the killing fields, and smell, hear, and see everything that's part of the industry necessary to produce that pound of ground beef? How many of us would just say, fuck that, I'm eating vegetarian today? Probably most of us. And for these reasons, as well as others I'll mention in a minute, capitalism, according to Marx, is wage theft. Wage labor is always exploitative to Marx because it wouldn't work if it wasn't. So let's start here because I haven't discussed this particular point yet on the show. Now, Marx isn't saying that people who save up some money and start a business are bad people when they hire employees. He's pointing out that at some point early into any product being commodified, that's just a fancy word that means taken up by the capitalist mode of production and mass-produced to make some investor a profit. When things become commodified like that, the demand will quickly outrun the supply. When a market opens up for that, the cool fiddle you carved from wood, or the horseshoes you made from scratch, or the cars that you and your wife put together in your barn, for anything, you can expect that the mom and pop team working from that barn to design, produce, and assemble a car from start to finish, they'll quickly find themselves at a disadvantage to anyone who can commodify that car, or the horseshoe, or the fiddle, because they can make so much more. Let's say mom and pop can assemble one car every 3 days if they work all day. Now, if they go to work for Henry Ford at the factory up the road, they can join a crew of 100 people and make 50 cars every hour. Now, who's going to sell more cars? The mom and pop crew who rebels and says, no, we aren't going to participate in capitalism. We're making our cars ourselves. Leave us alone. Or a factory that can outproduce them by thousands of %? The answer's pretty obvious. But that's not wage theft, at least not yet. Or is it? Because Marx would say, hold on, how is it that Henry Ford, or any member of the bourgeoisie, another Marx term that just means the people who own the factories and the industries, how is it that these people can open those places in the first place? And the answer is where Marx's wage theft is built into the system. See, Henry Ford can't run that factory. Nobody can run a factory unless they actually pay the mom and pop workers less than they're actually worth. Unless they pay everybody on the assembly line a wage that still leaves some money left over when the car or the horseshoe or the fiddle is eventually purchased on the market. That leftover money, it's called profit, and it's the very point of opening a business. But it's also, according to Marx, a way that the system of capitalism exploits workers because that extra money, that profit, it used to all go into mom and pop's pockets. Now mom and pop do all the work, and some fat cat up in an office overlooking the factory floor gets to bring home a bigger paycheck than either one of them for doing nothing. That's not fair. Well, at least not according to Marx. And because it's not fair, Marx predicted that those being paid wage labor would eventually get fed up, seize the means of production, the factories or the industries, and design an employee-owned organizational structure whereby profits could be split evenly and equitably among employees, thereby encouraging workers to maximize production and avoid waste. What a great idea. Well, in theory, it's a great idea. But Marx's prediction never panned out. I've talked about why in the last few episodes, so again, refer to those if you're not sure what I'm talking about. But there hasn't been any massive overthrow of the ruling class and a replacement with what he called communism, a system whereby profits would be shared amongst those who do the work. Now, I'm not a flat-out Marxist, not by a long shot. I mean, I could poke half a dozen holes in the basic description I just gave without even thinking too hard about it. You probably could too. Like, won't the people selected from the factory to be management, won't they need salaries? And since we would want the best managers in the plant in charge of the daily operations, shouldn't they actually be some of the best paid employees in the business? And haven't we just sort of redesigned the same system that Marx is saying will be overthrown? I mean, didn't we just replace the fat cats with new fat cats selected from the masses? And anyway, who says it's a bad thing to earn a profit? The new effective altruism movement, which I tend to support in many ways, it suggests that it makes way more sense to earn a shit ton of money and donate it all to a cause wherein you can do far more good than you could ever do if you just quit your job and dedicated your life to volunteerism. If Elon Musk had an epiphany 30 years ago and decided that he wanted to do the most good he could before he died, would he have accomplished that goal better by heading to Somalia and digging wells by hand until he died? say, digging 100 wells over the course of the next 50 years? Or would he have done more good by earning billions of dollars, which he could use to hire thousands of well diggers who could then dig millions of wells before he dies? Obviously, there's a way to view profit as far from pure evil. But that's not the point of this long-winded intro. My point lies in Marx's construction of wage labor as theft, because that's how nearly the entire so-called Western world works nowadays, by wage labor, or salaries, which are effectively the same thing. I mean, think about it. No matter what you do for a living, if you work for somebody, they have to pay you less than what they make for that work you do, less than you're worth. Because if they don't, their business isn't going to be around very long. And this is yet another piece of capitalism that leaves those of us operating beneath it feeling depressed, annoyed, unfulfilled, unrespected. We kind of know the business wouldn't exist if they paid us what we're actually worth, if they paid us what we actually bring into the business. And that's an annoying position to be stuck in. Now, alongside Marx and his partner Friedrich Engels, the second Friedrich for the day, lived a third Friedrich, who was also a philosopher, that you've probably never heard of. His name was Friedrich Feuerbach, and one of his philosophical claims will help us understand Marx's claim about religion being the opium of the people. Feuerbach asked us to look back through history to any era we wanted and to ask ourselves why, despite incredible differences between, say, the 1500s and the 2000s, when we look at things like criminality, morality, religiosity, sexuality, cultural norms, understandings of Christianity, even what it means to be a good citizen, despite these things changing massively over time periods like that, he'd say, don't you think it's odd that every step of the way we can track cultural values and note that they align with both economic values and religious values of the same era? I mean, what are the chances, Feuerbach would say, that the Catholic Church was endorsing the legitimacy of the king as the unquestionable authority figure placed there by God, at the same time as the economic system relied on that king for financial support, and the public actually viewed the king that way? What do you know? They're all the same. Okay, maybe the odds aren't too bad if we just look at one era. Perhaps the world was just set right at that historical epoch. So let's hop forward a few hundred years and ask Feuerbach's question again. Democracy comes into vogue in the same systems, the church, the economic system, the cultural norms of the era. They all align again. And now the church says humans should have a say in government because God would never appoint an unholy king to life terms without any oversight. Isn't that odd, Feuerbach would say? What are the chances that the church and the law and the state authority systems all changed in unison right alongside cultural norms? What if it wasn't an accident? What if God didn't change his mind 12,000 times over the last 1,000 years, and instead the church just changed its story to remain relevant in changing times? What if the law changes not as moral truths change, but rather as cultural norms change? What if we're looking at this all backward? So now let's jump back to Marx's claim. Religion is the opium of the masses. He's not saying that religion gets you high, although I'd argue as someone who has been incredibly intoxicated on it that it very much does. But that's not Marx's point. What are opioids prescribed for? Pain relief. That's what Marx is getting at. He's saying that we live in a fucked up world where most of us are required to put up with exploitation if we just want to survive. And then we're locked in a market where all the things we have to purchase to survive, they're alienated from the means of production, causing them to appear literally magic to us. If you don't know what I'm talking about there with the magic, check out the last couple episodes. But the short story is when that pound of ground beef is all nicely packaged in a bloodless, screamless, stenchless meat section at the supermarket, we replace the horror we might experience at seeing the means of production with a magic feeling that the product just sort of appeared on the shelf. Voila. But we still haven't quite unpacked what Marx meant. I mean, how can religion be the painkiller of the masses? To apply Feuerbach's point one more time, why did religion change at these strategic times? To remain relevant. And what does the public seem to need during our current historical epoch? What is it that nearly everyone can find some sort of comfort in? A story that helps them understand why the hell we're all subjecting ourselves to daily exploitation just to purchase magic products that never live up to the promises made by those selling them. And the final step, how does religion do this? Well, in the US, and in most places for that matter, religion paints this existence as a torturous trial run to prove oneself worthy of the paradise that awaits us after death. A paradise with no pain, no sorrow, and no fucking job I hate waiting to eat half of my waking life tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. Religion tells us, damn, it might be awful, but that's my job in this life. I'm supposed to grind it out, stay humble, take care of my people, and just show God how docile and good I can be. Maybe he's putting this on me as a test. That's what the contemporary version of Christianity emphasizes. No matter which brand you prefer, from Presbyterian to Baptist to Catholic to my childhood brand, evangelical. The main mission stated by all of these groups is to convince people that Jesus is the Son of God who came to earth to save us all from our sins so that we can arrive at the real life awaiting us, the eternal life that will make this petty test that we all call life seem so insignificant that we'll laugh at ourselves for how miserable we thought we were at these jobs. All we got to do is tough it out, keep our heads down, and pour our worries and pains on the Lord. That's what religion does to ease our pain and suffering. It's the opiate of the masses. Now, if this is all ringing bells, it really should be. It's the same promises made by pharma. Do you have itchy junk or twitchy legs? Buy this pill and you'll go to amusement parks with your friend, ride horses on the beach, and be so happy you won't be able to stop smiling. It's what the vacation industry tells us. Your life would be so much better if you just take this cruise, visit this city, see this site, patronize this business. It's what capitalism tells us on every front. Yeah, you got a car, but is it as sleek, fast, and fun as this one looks? If you buy this new car you don't need, your life will be so much better. It's the norm of our era, the zeitgeist of the 21st century. We're a cult of cults. A group of people who are all buying into our own brand of nonsense promises and desperately trying to convince ourselves that our answer is the right answer, that our political candidate is the best political candidate, that this new medication will finally work, that everything will be better if I can just make it to that promotion next year. Religion is the opium of the masses. That's the show. Thanks for listening. I'm Ben Boyce.